Hi. Yeah, first of all, our apologies for keeping you waiting for so long. Okay, and for the record, could you please state your names and the organizations that you represent?
Hi everyone. I'm Nicholas Fang. I represent Black Dot Private Limited, but I'm here in a personal capacity.
I'm Lim San San. I'm from the Singapore University of Technology and Design, and I'm also here in my personal capacity.
Okay, the evidence which you'll be giving today before the committee will be taken on oath. If you so desire, you can take an affirmation. Clerk, please administer the oath.
Could you raise up your right hand?
Yes.
Can read the affirmation. I, your name is what?
Do we take turns or
Together.
together? I, Lim San San, do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence which I shall give before this committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please be seated. Welcome to the public hearing on the Select Committee on Deliberate Online Falsehoods. The focus for today's evidence gathering session is for us to put questions to you, and you have taken a solemn obligation to answer our questions truthfully. And I'll now call on Dr. Janil to start.
Professor Lim, Mr. Fang, thank you.
Can I just say something? I hope you wouldn't mind if I take a few minutes break and then come back. Thank you. You can understand.
We do.
Disrespect.
Professor Lim, Mr. Fang, thank you very much for your patience and for your submissions as well as coming before us today. Both of you have said that you're coming in your personal capacity, but both of you have considerable experience that is relevant to the work of this committee and the questions before us. Perhaps you might like to take a few minutes to tell us the experience that you have professionally, which informs your standing, as it were, in commenting on some of these issues. And before we get to the rest of the submissions, maybe Professor Lim, you want to take a few minutes just to tell us a little bit about your background and your standing to come forward on these issues, and then Mr. Fang.
So I'm a professor of media and communication, and I have been working on young people and technology, how they incorporate technology into everyday lives. And I've been working on this since for about 20 years now. And one of the big issues, obviously, when you look at young people and the way in which they incorporate technology is the media literacy challenges that they encounter. And obviously, from the time that I first began my research till now, the technological landscape has changed quite dramatically. And so there's been very different kinds of pressures that are being imposed on media users, and particularly with the last few years where we've seen the really dramatic shifts in information technology, that it's become quite overwhelming for people to be able to consume technology in a way that is discriminating, in a way that is discerning, that can allow them to be able to tell apart, for example, authentic news from falsehoods, which is where we are today.
Yes. We will come to the meat of all that in a few minutes. Just wanted to establish that you have a significant amount of experience in this area in terms of research, as well as in terms of teaching people about the relevant factors.
Right. That's right.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fang.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janil, and to members for also staying back so late. Thank also to Chairman. My personal background is primarily in media, so in the practice of communications, in journalism. I founded and I currently run a strategic communications consultancy that offers a full suite of public relations, communications, consultancy services to clients from a broad range that includes government, private sector, corporate, fintech, consumer, sports. My journalistic career started with the Straits Times. I was a journalist there for 9 years, and I subsequently moved on to MediaCorp, where I worked at Channel News Asia, and was, in my last position, the Deputy Chief Editor of Singapore News for MediaCorp. I was a former NMP, and I also serve as the chair of the Strategic Communications Expert Panel for MINDEF.
Mr. Fang, if I may add, and you could comment on this, apart from your experience in media, you have some background and interest in both military affairs as well as affairs relating to international relations, both in terms of your work as an NMP, your experience in the military, as well as your work in SIIA as well.
That's
You
right.
want to say a few words about that?
Sure. So I also currently serve as one of the hazards of wearing too many hats. I tend to leave out bits and pieces, but I also serve as the executive director at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, which is a non-government independent think tank in Singapore focused on regional geopolitics, environment, and other issues. And in my, besides my volunteer service as the chair of the Strategic Communications Expert Panel for MINDEF, in my national service role, in my reserve role, I also operate within the information operations sphere.
Thank you very much. So between the two of you, you have considerable experience to bring to bear on the problem before us, but very different perspectives. Academia, research, the media, the national security and international relations issues, as well as then now the private media sector as a practitioner. What I propose to do is to have a little bit of a summary, refreshing the various things that have been put before the committee, the positions that we are considering or have arrived at. And as I do that, I would just maybe ask for your agreement or comments, if any. And I would suggest we perhaps, in that part of it, we could leave the discussion about solutions to later, because I will then go on, once we've established that we are some degree of agreement about what the scope and scale and nature of the problem is, then what are the different types of things that we can do about it. And in that second phase, I would suggest we go through the variety of suggestions that have been put forward to this committee from a number of parties, perhaps gets your comments on that, as well as the suggestions that both of you have put in your representations, and we could have a bit of a discussion on that. That's what I propose to do before then opening up to my colleagues for further questions as well. So I'm sure that you've heard some of the things that we've talked about. We are presented with the idea that deliberate online falsehoods reduces trust, and that type of trust that it reduces is social trust between people, institutional trust, the police, the courts, the organizations that we have, trust in our democracy, in our process of politics and governance, as well as trust in the process of receiving and consuming news and information. Those are positions you can both broadly agree with, I hope. So you just need to vocalize so that it becomes part of the transcript.
Yes, I agree.
Furthermore, the idea that the process of deliberate online falsehoods both exploits existing divisions and polarizations within society, it rides on those polarizations and divisions, but also contributes to its amplifications. Again, I think is something both of you all will agree.
Yes.
So we talked about it from a sort of whole of society point of view, the divisions within society, and then at the level of the individual, the prevalence of deliberate online falsehoods can radicalize or push individuals to extreme points of view. I think this is something both of you have commented upon in your submissions as well.
That's correct.
So then these then translate to very significant real-world consequences. And those real-world consequences span the breadth of possibilities from violence, destabilization of societies, national security issues, economic impacts, political impacts, as well as amplification of racial and religious tensions. So perhaps I'll stop there and ask if you have any comments about the characterization of just how serious a problem this is, if I've left anything out, or if there's further nuance to that characterization you'd like to add.
I think I would start by adding that this, besides being in agreement with the focus and the sort of implications of the discussions thus far, I think one thing that has potentially emerged has been a bit of a focus and a debate on certain aspects of online falsehoods or fake news, which largely pertain to the social environment and also potentially the political environment. This concern about suppressing certain views. But in my submission, and I think more broadly, would like also to emphasize, and I think some of the previous witnesses have also testified to the fact that it is a broader and potentially more serious issue. There are concerns over national security, stability, and some of the ideas that you mentioned, Dr. Janil, about the issue of trust pertain to how citizens would react together or towards certain institutions that are critical to the ongoing stability of a country, of a nation state. So much more, and I know that it is tempting to focus a lot on the more heated debates on political views, suppression of freedom of speech, and issues like that. But on a more macro level, if we take a step back, there is a genuine concern, and we see many examples around the world, and I think that Singapore has not been spared in recent years on some of the influence and impact of various actors, state, non-state, that potentially don't make the headlines, they don't actually get reported on, but are very clear efforts to create an influence, we call it influence operations rather than information operations, because the end effect is to change behavior, to affect behavior of people, and then more broadly of a country. And those are things that are very real. They're not hypothetical. They're not something that is purely a technical discussion. And I think that we need to remember that when we talk about the seriousness of this. I think the fact that there is a select committee that we're devoting this amount of time and debate, quite unprecedented, I think, in recent memory, underscores this. And I hope people understand that there is a real reason behind this.
So you contend that we are already exposed to not just deliberate online falsehoods, but deliberate online falsehoods with significant malicious intent targeting Singaporeans?
Yes, I believe so. And I think that if you look at various examples around the region, it's probably not difficult to imagine how a country like Singapore, for the various characteristics that we have, for the position that we have on the global stage, represents a target that's desirable to be influenced. And we have certain aspects of our sort of national DNA that make it very susceptible to such things. Our openness, our globalization, we're highly wired, we're technologically advanced, and our citizens are very, very connected. Make us a very viable target for people using information operations through technology, through online platforms to try to influence us.
Professor Lim, you have similar views?
Thank you, Nicholas, for that. I just wanted to actually add from the social dimension. If we think about the emergence of online falsehoods as a threat or as a problem, we could possibly say that Singapore is now actually encountering a sort of perfect storm, because we've got the technological landscape, which clearly, sees our citizenry being very hyper-connected. We've also been deluged with information because all of us are so well linked with so many information and communication platforms. At the same time, we've got a socio-cultural climate that lends itself to people sharing a lot of information. So, for example, if you saw some of the witnesses who came before, they talked about how the elderly like to send, fake news just as a kind of greeting or as a kind of social interaction. And we've got that social approval when people are seen to be newsy, to be informative, to be sharing the latest information. So the technological landscape plus the socio-cultural climate, as well as the psychological biases that we all hold, along with our geopolitical situation, actually creates a perfect storm where online falsehoods can emerge and can also thrive. But at the same time, we must also look at the silver linings. In the same way that we are hyper-connected and can therefore be vulnerable to online falsehoods, we can also leverage this hyper-connectivity in order to send out corrections of this information, as well as to, again, leverage the hyper-connectivity to educate the public and to, raise the general level of media literacy.
Prof. Lim, it may be a little bit of an oversimplification the way I'm asking the question, but do you think, on the basis of that analysis, that we are more vulnerable to deliberate online falsehoods than other societies, or less vulnerable? Are we more resilient or less resilient at the moment?
I would say that given the history of Singapore and the fact that we've been able to maintain our social and racial harmony for this long, that certainly there is some natural resilience, but it would necessarily also mean that we should continue to safeguard and to put in place precautionary measures that don't allow these harmony and stability to be threatened.
Any other comments on these issues? No. So if I could move on then, just before we start talking about what are the possible measures and interventions, in terms of understanding the causes for the situation that we have arrived at today, I'm sure both of you would agree that the status quo is unacceptable on the basis of both of your submissions as well as what you have just said, that we have to then think of what next interventions to consider. But firstly, I'm sure from your practice as well as the submissions that you've perhaps been following, you would agree that part of the problem is the low cost and high impact available to people who want to perpetrate these falsehoods and spread them. And that in terms of the state-to-state action or even non-state actors, that these types of tactics enhance the conventional warfare, reduce the necessary resources that need to be applied to kinetic and conventional warfare. I'm sure you agree with those positions that have been put before the committee.
Yes.
Secondly, in terms of the causes, that part of the cause is the business model and financial incentives available for the various players in this space, whether they are the social media platforms, who have been characterized as ad networks, serving business interests rather than users, whether they are small or alternative media sites trying to muscle in on the space and needing to drive traffic to them, and the advertisers themselves have an incentive to drive this kind of behavior so that they're able to target consumers a bit more effectively. So there are business reasons why we are in the situation we are in today. Am I right
Yes.
to say that?
Yes.
And the process of developing and spreading online falsehoods, because of the anonymity and the deniability afforded by the technology, it allows an ongoing insidious process, laying the ground for further work. Yes? And finally, one of the significant causes which the committee has been taken through is how much the process of developing and spreading deliberate online falsehoods leverages upon our, what are essentially biological factors, our tendency to engage in motivated reasoning, to look for the material that confirms our biases and worldview, to work in groups and to seek peer affirmation, that there are biological, what we have referred to as heuristic or behavioral factors which reinforce the ease of spread, the desirability of consumption, and the difficulty of overcoming deliberate online falsehoods. And those are a significant factor in dealing with this.
Yes. Psychological predispositions.
I would add on to that as well, Dr. John, if I could. I think we've had some witnesses testify over the past few days that, there's a certain acceptability to leave some falsehoods out there for everyone to chew on, to have a bit of a debate, and so that when we come to the realization that it is a falsehood, it's much more powerful, and people will be more accepting of the fact that these are false. I think the point that you just raised, and I think both of us agree very strongly, is that the danger of online falsehoods or fake news, the phenomenon of fake news, I would dispute using the term fake news because it gives some credibility to it. There's nothing newsy about fake news. Is the fact that it targets innate psychological predispositions, it targets the emotions, and potentially having evolved from the sort of ecosystem that you've described, where there's a business motive or a profit motive, for people to leverage on these kind of tendencies to achieve a certain effect, whether it's to get people to buy a service, to purchase a product. They've figured out what works most effectively, and they're leveraging on this. And if we assume that there is space for people to have a considered intellectual discussion about the potential for something to be fake or not, and then to eventually arrive at a very logical and well thought out conclusion, that's not how fake news and the phenomenon of fake news and the platforms being used by fake news, that's not how they work. They work on getting an immediate emotive response. They work on getting people to share and spread things without really thinking, at literally the click of a button. And that's what makes it so dangerous.
Thank you. If we could move to the discussion then of potential measures and interventions that we need to consider. I think quite clearly a number of people, including both yourselves, have put forward the idea that there's no single idea that is going to be sufficient to tackle this problem adequately, that whatever it is we do needs to be multifaceted. It needs to be iterative because the challenge is likely to change quite rapidly over time. It will be based on a foundation of awareness and public education, no doubt, but that all those are not going to be sufficient. Yes?
Yes.
And then if I could just expand on the point that Mr. Fang just made, would both of you all agree then that deliberate online falsehoods have no useful role in and of themselves, that they should not a priori be protected and as anything that is useful to civic discourse or the larger aims of public good? Would that be a position that you can agree with?
Yes, although if an online falsehood has already made its way into the public space, to actually address it would be quite useful as a form of underlining some of the principles that the society holds dear.
No, sorry, no, my question was that there is no positive reason to allow deliberate online falsehoods to spread, that nothing good comes out of just...
To spread, yes.
I mean, there are concerns about how we might tackle them, and there are potential negative consequences as a result of our interventions. But from a starting position, deliberate online falsehoods themselves have nothing good about them.
We
Yes.
don't have anything good, innately good, but if we consider the example, the idea of having a negative example that you could show to people and point to it and say, that's false, please recognize that that's false, and anything that's similar to that or builds on that, you should recognize as false as well. I think that's a view that has been put out there. It's something that people should be able to recognize. But I think the fundamental idea about falsehoods, about fake news, is that it is purely a lie. It's something that is completely untrue. And hopefully we get to a stage where people can recognize that for what it is, instead of having to be taught or shown something that is explaining what false really is.
Okay. So the various interventions we'll come to, we talked about they should be multifaceted, but it also implies that perhaps there need to be various players, various actors who are involved in these interventions or measures. I'd suggest 5: the technology companies, the media companies, the state, the government, in terms of the governance and policy, but other aspects of the state with respect to education. And the 5th aspect would be some degree of personal responsibility by members of the public. Would you
Yes.
broadly agree with some of those things?
Very much so.
Yes.
If we could then move to the specifics within that space, I think both of you had suggested that fact-checking, some kind of establishing sources of truth, should be an important part of these measures. Not suggesting that that's not correct, but I put to you that, firstly, shouldn't this already be happening? If we look at some of the responsibilities of those 5 players, especially the media and people producing this content, shouldn't fact-checking be at the heart of their existing work and their business? And so can we rely on fact-checking as a further intervention to deal with the challenges?
I have 2 points that I would make on that. I think I agree 100% that the journalism career, the vocation of being a journalist, should be predicated precisely on being accurate. Within the MediaCorp newsroom, the sort of ethos is spelled out as ACT, where A stands for accurate, C stands for contextual, and T stands for timely, and that's actually in order of priority. So rather than, some people might argue, well, if you're not first and not fast, you lose your audience. I think the priority is to get things right, to ensure that people have the right and accurate information to make very important decisions on. By providing that context, you're actually explaining to people the relevance and the importance of the information. And then, of course, timeliness. You don't want to report the news that's too late. I think that is first and foremost the role of, and it should be the core values of the media and of journalism. I think
potentially anybody producing such content, should
Yes, exactly. I sort of raised an eyebrow when I saw some. I see people described as journalists, non-mainstream media journalists. I think that builds on the early concept of a citizen journalist. So if you think of journalists encompassing all these people, anybody producing content, then these core values should apply. Unfortunately, I don't think they do. The second point I wanted to make was on this issue of fact-checking. I think there have been some suggestions in the past couple of weeks of creating some kind of body that is the arbiter of truth, whether it's an ombudsman, whether it's a council, whether it's a committee. My big concern about that is that it seems to be outsourcing and devolving the responsibility for finding out the truth away from the individual and putting it in the hands of somebody else. I don't know if that's an innately Singaporean response. Probably not. We do see some similar phenomenon around the world. But I would like to see that rather than pushing the problem away, individuals really try to embrace that, rather try to take responsibility for finding out what's true for myself. And I think if we can build something like that, then we go a long way to achieving a problem. I think one of the descriptions was that fake news is like a festering disease, but there's concerns that if we put in place medicine in the form of laws or legislation, then they become too widespread and they kind of sterilize the entire environment. Well, I would say that then the actual solution should be trying to inoculate every single individual, every single Singaporean, every single citizen with that sort of drive to find out what the truth is for yourself, and then equipping them with the tools and giving them the right training and environment. But that's the safest inoculation, and it's probably the most effective rather than trying to find a one-stop solution, whether it's laws or anything else.
Professor Lim, you'd have some similar views on
Yes,
fact-checking and then
I
media
think-
literacy, which is what Nicholas has brought us to.
Yes, that's right. I think I have been, as a media literacy proponent, I've been very heartened by this whole select committee process because it's really shown the spotlight on the whole issue of media literacy. And everyone has been talking about media literacy. And yet, I do want to speak up for the little people. I want to speak up for the media consumers because ultimately, it's very easy to say, well, the solution is media literacy. But if you think about how complex and how cacophonous our media landscape has become today, we have to consider that media literacy has become truly multifaceted. So, for example, if you want to really be a completely discerning consumer, you've got to understand all of the transforming technological affordances that are emerging every day. We constantly have to learn new apps. We have to learn about changes in apps. At the same time, we've also got to be aware of the fact that media companies are merging and there are mergers and acquisitions. That means that one day, the information that I share with Facebook is actually going to be shared with WhatsApp, is actually going to be shared with Instagram, right? At the same time, there are all these newly emerging media genres that, again, as media consumers, we've got to understand, oh, actually, this is parody, actually, this is satire. And it's really quite difficult to be able to keep up with all of these. So I can tell you, as a media professor, I find it difficult to keep up with all of these transformations, let alone the lay media consumer. So I want to say that, well, on the one hand, it's truly wonderful that we are talking about the importance of media literacy, but it is really important that we pour in as much resources as possible into making media literacy education much more sophisticated in order to keep pace with the dramatic transformations that we have seen in our media landscape today.
And you have some comments about the process of fact-checking or who should be doing the fact-checking?
Well, I think it would be quite ideal to have a range of players. So, for example, the technology companies and the media companies should certainly be engaging in fact-checking on their own, but it's also useful to have civic society type efforts in fact-checking because part of that fact-checking is actually educational at the same time. So the platform that, for example, my SUTD students are developing that we are going to then hand over to NUS students to run is actually meant to be a community effort for people to actually engage in fact-checking, but in the process, understand what are the markers of authentic news, what are the markers of good journalism, what are the giveaway signs of fake news or online falsehoods.
So if I could perhaps summarize both your points of view, you both agree that fact-checking is necessary, but it really should be the responsibility of people who are already operating and working in this space, whether you're a civil society organization, whether you're a student, whether you're a media company, whether you are a platform, that part of your responsibility should be to establish the facts rather than abrogate that responsibility to yet another third party. That's the general view that you have on that.
Yes, but I also would add on to say that besides people operating in that space, I think all of us, every individual operates in that space as sometimes as a consumer of news, of information, of data. So the onus also lies with the final consumer to make some kind of decision or have some ability to discern whether something is true or false.
Indeed. But Mr. Fang, I would characterize that latter part of what you said as more similar to what Prof. Lim has called media literacy. So we are sort of fact-checking by the people producing and distributing, and then media literacy by the members of the public and the consumers. I mean, I don't know if that's the semantics of it, but that's how I would perhaps think of it. But I think we're on the same page on that, right?
Definitely. I think a big part of media literacy is being able to understand what media is and to evaluate whether the media, whichever product you're consuming, is worth or safe to be consumed.
But Prof. Lim, your point is that potentially that might be quite challenging for broad sections of the consuming public, that what are our expectations of how far media literacy can go in terms of protecting us from this. We should ask for it, we should support it and encourage it, but perhaps it can't go far enough to deal with the extent of the challenge. I think that's is that a
Can't
summary?
go far enough and fast enough.
Can't go far enough and fast enough to deal with the challenge that we are facing. Okay. If I could move then to some of the other suggestions that we have heard. We've had requests that the tech companies do more. We've had a number of arguments about whether that's possible or desirable. Requests for the tech companies to do takedowns of offensive content, block the spread, the virality of deliberate online falsehoods. Some of the issues are that, firstly, that self-regulation is going to be unlikely because the business model of the tech companies, the social media platforms, actually disincentivizes them from behaving the way we would like them to behave. And perhaps not so reasonable for them to do something which potentially could impact their revenue stream. They appear to be happier if there's a legal backing to enact some of these either takedowns or interventions. They also don't want to be the arbiters of truth. Some are more willing than others, depending on what type of truth you're talking about. They've been willing to do it for things like child pornography. They've stated that they're willing to do it for things like extremism and terrorism, but perhaps not far enough. They have been able to do it for things that impinge upon copyright, the distribution of copyrighted material. But ultimately, they perhaps don't want to be thought of and regulated as media companies, and that perhaps is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for getting them involved. But largely, they and the various other representatives that have come, witnesses that have come, agree that the demonetization of the perpetrators and distributors of deliberate online falsehoods is an important intervention that we need to be able to achieve. Would you agree with this? And would you have further comments on this point, that in order to be effective, we need to find some way to remove the financial incentive to create and spread and propagate deliberate online falsehoods? So various, to explain, for example, Facebook wants to deal with it in a way to, for example, reduce the incentive for advertising dollars to support deliberate online falsehoods. Other suggestions have been that we need to go and find people who spread deliberate online falsehoods, or to deal with the ability for advertisers to be able to then park their adverts associated with material that is found to be deliberately false. So is that a position that you would agree with, or do you have some further comments on that?
I think obviously the intention is correct. My only query, and I'm not speaking as somebody who's very an expert in terms of the technical aspects of this, but in terms of trying to stem the tide, I'm not sure what scope there is, because the monetary incentive is very clear. We've already discussed how effective some of these tools are in achieving the aims of winning people's minds and hearts, and affecting consumer behavior and buying behavior as well. Are we being a little bit optimistic to say that we can actually stop it and turn it around? Because we may be able to stop one mode of it, but it probably would evolve into something else that is driven by similar motivations, but maybe just in a different form. I think one company choosing to do it, or two companies, or three, maybe all the big companies trying to do it, would be a great first step. My only question would be how effective it would be in being, completely achieving the aims of what it would be, and whether it's something that's sustainable in the long run.
I would actually appeal to enlightened self-interest of these companies that they should start to really think about codes of conduct as to what constitutes ethical behavior. And insofar as they are now actually working on these business models that are primarily profit-driven, I think it's important to appeal to these companies to really reflect quite strongly on how they should tweak these purely commercially driven algorithms to take into account other factors that will make them much more responsible purveyors of information.
So broadly, you agree that the money is an issue, money is a problem. Professor Lim, you're hoping that there will be some corporate social responsibility around this. And Mr. Fang, you're worried about whether or not this is doable in the long run and whether or not it's going to be sufficient. Okay. If I could perhaps also now move to your submissions. You had both made some concrete suggestions about what we can do to address some of the challenges in this space. And they're slightly different. I think Prof. Lim, you are concerned about how we can improve media literacy significantly. And I think, Mr. Fang, you're largely concerned about how we can improve the quality of journalism as a way of dealing with some of these things. Perhaps I might characterize, if I could start with Professor Lim, that my view or my questions about some of the proposals, while I would agree that media literacy, as we've discussed, certainly needed, but this is a long-term solution. It's not going to have any short or immediate effect. And that even if we get this right, it's going to be difficult to deal with all the other factors. So how can we do media literacy better, given that the significant challenge that there is for what media literacy can do for us?
Well, I think a very important first step is for us as a nation to recognize that media literacy should actually be considered to be up there with literacy, because obviously, Singapore has been able to take care of literacy, and we've got among the highest literacy rates around the world. But precisely because we're such a literate nation and we're so hyper-connected, all the more that we must recognize that media literacy is a fundamental literacy that we must vest in all of our citizens. But primarily also on the whole issue of media literacy, at the moment, if we look at the efforts that are out there, I think they are quite admirable. They are certainly not without value. But hitherto, I would say that the media literacy efforts have been somewhat modest. They have really been sort of going for low-hanging fruit in terms of, explaining to people what are the telltale signs, how you can safeguard your online privacy, and so on. But really, when we're looking at a media environment where media purveyors, especially purveyors of online falsehoods, can produce highly sophisticated content that is very often indistinguishable from authentic content, that you therefore really need to be much more ambitious in terms of your media literacy education. And we need to really apprise people of the fact that there are all of these political and economic motivations that will drive purveyors of online falsehoods to produce online falsehoods in a particular way so as to be able to profit either for political interests or for commercial ones.
Thank you.
Mr.
Fang, if I could,
yes, go ahead.
would you want to make a comment on the literacy, or?
Yes,
Okay,
I was
please.
going to make a comment on the literacy. I think again, similar to some of the comments, we see, especially the efforts such as what's being done by the National Library Board, very commendable. But I think there is probably a need to ramp up the urgency for these efforts. We see a lot of efforts being rolled out in the neighborhoods to help the elderly become more conversant with technology, to be able to do online banking, to be able to understand how to access some of the online functions. I think to tag on to that component, there's probably a need to add in exactly this concept of media literacy, especially in the digital world. People say, I have experiences with the elderly who say that, it's too complicated, it's very scary, I don't really know how to figure some of these things out. But they sure know how to share information with their WhatsApp chat groups, right? They're very, very good at that. They're very, very fast with that. But when it comes to thinking about the information, I can't really figure out, how it works, and there's so many factors to consider. Well, if you can share it, I think you should jolly well know whether what you're sharing has an impact or not. My bigger fear when it comes to this challenge of media literacy is that if it comes to a stage where Prof. Lim was mentioning it's a bit complex, it becomes a little bit scary, whether it's for a young person or for the elderly, we may end up in what is known as informational crisis, where people basically say that I can't figure out what to trust, I don't know what is real and what is false, so I'll just stop consuming news. I'll just stay within my own silo, and my day-to-day life, it's not really affected, knowing what's true and what platforms I can trust. And they may be able to function on a day-to-day basis, but then when we come to national events where individual choice matters, so obviously elections or where a popular vote is being cultivated, that's when the problem will really surface, and I don't think we can afford to wait until that stage to then say, okay, I'll try to figure it out now.
I just want to add on the issue of media literacy, and also to connect to your earlier question about the role of technology companies. I think clearly technology companies can be far more proactive in terms of the media literacy efforts that they're mounting. Primarily, technology companies really need to be much more transparent with consumers about the kinds of strategies that they use in order to decide what information to serve up in what priority. Because ultimately, as consumers, we need to understand how it is that our media landscape is being shaped for us. And until and unless the technology companies are far more transparent and far more explicit with consumers, it's very difficult for us to not realize that we're being manipulated.
Thank you very much. If I could turn to Mr. Fang, your submission, and particularly your suggestions around media excellence. And you've made a number of suggestions, some of which we've covered, but there's one where you talk about the role that the news industry and journalism can play to deal with this problem. If I might summarize some of the intention, I think what you're trying to achieve is to serve the public good and reinforce trust in mainstream media by your suggestion. But your suggestion, summarized by one paragraph in your submission, related to this point is my suggestion that the news industry and journalism be de-linked from the profit motives of media companies in Singapore. If I turn the page over, another summary statement, you have what then is needed is a change in the framework, and one model that can be considered is to have the news functions of these companies separated from the rest of the business and held under a not-for-profit umbrella where the sole mandate is to deliver excellence in journalism. And in the rest of your submission, you've gone on to say how some of these ideas have been derived from the model of the BBC in the UK. There are a variety of reasons why such a model might be attractive or unattractive. There are a variety of reasons why such a model might improve journalistic quality or not. But specific to the challenge that we are dealing with, how would it address the issue of deliberate online falsehoods? And I'm sure you are not suggesting that these companies are the source of deliberate online falsehoods, right? So hence the framework is not to deal with that type of problem. It is for the resultant structure to be intervening in the space of deliberate online falsehoods. And to me, that is the bit on which I am not clear. How would this suggestion result in our being able to more effectively deal with deliberate online falsehoods? If you could please explain.
Sure. Well, I think we've already started to touch a little bit on my answer, or on the elements of my answer, when we said that when it comes to fact-checking, the media and the journalism industry one of the hallmarks of the operations should be accuracy, should be this drive to ensure that whatever is reported is accurate, is factual. I think that the media, at least as far as I have hopes for it, should be viewed as a trusted, respected, and credible source for information. I think the media in Singapore fulfills a number of functions, but one of the key ones is to be the platform of record, where hard facts and information are presented in a clear and accurate way so that people have the information that they need at their fingertips. My biggest concern is that people are turning away from traditional media, from mainstream media, due to competition from other sources, many of it online, many of it digital in nature. We can call it alternative forms of media, we can call it citizen journalism, we can call it community-driven, ground-up efforts at producing content that is similar to journalism. For a number of reasons, technologically, they are far more accessible. Some of them were designed to be very accessible by the young generation that is technologically connected. They are mobile, they are accessible on various devices and platforms. So they become much more appealing than the mainstream traditional forms of media, although they are adapting as well. But at the same time, I think if you look at the example of Donald Trump, I know it's an example that's been used to death, but it does really show how mainstream media has been widely discredited by the leader of a country, and basically, consumers have been turned away from traditional sources of media, traditional media, to alternative platforms, social media, and private accounts on Twitter, for example. So I think that if we can restore some, not necessarily respectability, but people's appreciation for traditional media, for all the things that they are good for, the context, the accuracy, the rigorousness, the multiple layers of checking that gets done before anything gets published, gets pushed out on various platforms, that would enable these, what I consider pillars of the antithesis of fake news, the pillars of truth, to become more respected, more accepted, and then hopefully in the long run more consumed by people who are currently picking up information from a variety of alternative sources, which then becomes the playground for fake news and purveyors of fake news to operate in. So my point was that if we can refocus the emphasis on journalistic excellence, where the hallmark of all the media companies, traditional media or otherwise in Singapore, is on journalistic excellence, and consumers are made aware of this and accept that this is what they're paying for, ostensibly. They would actually then realize that these are the right sources, the respectable sources to consume information, and that would be a good counter to fake news.
Your explanation is attractive, but I'm going to continue to challenge you, because our mainstream media in Singapore continues to be fairly trusted. I mean, and people have disputed that, but in general, most of the people coming as witnesses and most of the information that we have suggests that our mainstream media continues to be a trusted source of information and facts for most Singaporeans. But what you're proposing is a change of business model, a change of operating framework. So if today the mainstream media that we have is already trusted, what are you trying to achieve by that? And is it to deal with the problem today, or is it to deal with what you anticipate of some future problem? I mean, is it something that will serve the business model interests of the company? But how does that deal with the problem of the deliberate online falsehoods that are spreading today, when today, with this business model, we already have these robust media companies that are trusted? So you obviously see that there's some advantage to be gained by such a change in the business model and framework, but what is it?
That's a good point. On the issue of trust, I agree that the traditional forms of media are viewed by Singaporeans as trusted sources. But there was data that came out around the end of 2015 or early 2016 that showed that on a day-to-day basis, people found other sources of media attractive. Now, when did they sort of turn back or return to traditional sources of media? It was in times of major events. I would hesitate to call them crises, but major events. So in 2015, obviously, it was a very busy year for everyone, but there were two highlight events where when surveys of consumers were done, people said that at those times, they flocked immediately to the news on television or newspapers. And that was in the death of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and it was also ahead of the general elections in 2015. Those two events, you suddenly saw a spike where people said, okay, in these periods, I'm coming to particular sources, and it's going to be these, the trusted media, whether it's the Straits Times or Channel News Asia or MediaCorp. And those were quite interesting figures, and I think that sort of underlines maybe anecdotally what we see, where on a day-to-day basis, people, you don't really see too many people holding newspapers in the MRT trains anymore. So everything is on digital sources and not necessarily the digital platforms of the mainstream media outlets. So in times of crisis, we see that. But how do we bring people then back to consume this on a day-to-day basis in their daily lives. And I think the numbers show that viewership and readership are falling from traditional media, regardless of whether people view them as trustworthy or not. They may see them as trustworthy, they may not consume them because they don't see it as attractive. So my point is, how do you create this attraction and bring people back to your mainstream media platforms? And I think to re-emphasize what many of us within the news industry would probably know, but I don't think it's exactly very widespread among the general public, is that there are these core values, right? It's about accuracy, it's about context. I don't just give you the facts and figures, I also make sense of it, and I give you historical reference, I give you comparisons, so that you can make up your mind about these sort of things. It's much more than just sort of snapshot tweets, whether it's 140 or 280 characters. It's much more than a headline that you can then click on and share. It is in-depth reporting. It's backed up by people whose pure vocation is producing news, and who then operate in a framework where there are multiple levels of checks and editors who go through and scrub through the information. And if you can restore a little bit of that shine to mainstream media platforms, I think you then create a similarly attractive option for people, other than the more sort of exciting or trendy platforms that are gaining credence today. So that was the point, and I think that it is not something that will happen overnight. I think most of us who know anything about the media industry in Singapore in particular know that mainstream media, traditional media, face a number of challenges, both in terms of reputation, in terms of credibility. But it's not just a Singaporean problem. Again, I refer to the situation in the US, where, and in the UK as well, where your traditional sort of pillars of the media industry are now being poo-pooed as being fake or being controlled by various interests. So I think that it is a global problem, and I hope that we in Singapore can start in some way or measure to restore some of that shine.
So if I might just summarize that before moving on to the next section, the idea you have is to, in a way, look at the business model and operating framework of our media companies in Singapore to address the idea of what people do for news and information consumption on a daily basis, as opposed to at sort of high visibility or crisis events. And this, in a way, feeds into Prof. Lim's concern about how we can shape media literacy. Actually, the two suggestions have some reinforcement that if we can increase where people get the sources of news and what they trust in that sources of news, how that might shape media literacy on a way going forward. So really, you're suggesting this is a kind of inoculation resilience strategy going forward, perhaps, again, a longer-term benefit rather than an immediate benefit.
I think maybe I didn't necessarily make myself very clear in terms of the business model. Why do I suggest that we need to separate the profit motive? I think within the newsrooms, there is generally this emphasis on the ethos on producing good quality news to inform, educate, and to engage and entertain. But when you work for large companies, and both large media companies in Singapore are of quite a significant size. They have many different types of operations, and at the end of the day, there is a need to answer for your operations, for your profits, and for your costs, and for your revenues. And then when you juxtapose that against the competition for the ad dollar that is becoming more and more stringent, when you look at all the different types of competitive pressures from the online space, it's no surprise then that there are people within these organizations who say, so how do we get a share of that? And obviously, a key element of that is grabbing eyeballs, is grabbing your audience, your readership, your subscription, and then you then try to figure out what consumers want, and what consumers want is tending towards these obviously more exciting, more fast-paced, more techie type of platforms where they can get their stuff on demand all the time. So how do we compete against that? I'm not saying that delinking it necessarily from profit motive will be the universal solution, but I think it would be a start, because it creates another distraction for the media industry to sort of fall back to its core values and emphasize that again.
Thank you. So if I could move then finally to the issue of legislation, which has generated quite a lot of interest, but as we've repeatedly said, is only one of the many things that we need to consider. Would you agree with a sort of a summary of our thinking, or the thinking presented to us around legislation? Well, firstly, that for many of the proposed measures it would be necessary to have legislation, otherwise the measures wouldn't even be possible, whether they are takedown measures or demonetization measures or apologies or clarifications. And that a number of the legal experts, professors and students have now clarified that there are gaps in the law as it exists today, and that we would need some legal measures to close those gaps. To address the problems of today, let alone potential problems that we would have in the future. Further, that if we are going to have legislative tools, these tools need to address the issue that of intent behind people spreading material that may or may not be malicious, it may or may not be deliberate, the harm or potential real-world consequences of the material that are under consideration, not the falsity per se, but the potential harm in the real world. And that the structure should allow for fair commentary and public discourse and parody and satire and comedy, all the necessary things that we want as part of society. But that legislation, that getting the legislation right is really part of government's responsibility in this space. It's not enough just to make statements of intent and on top of that invest. We actually have a responsibility to get our legislation right around this space. That the tools of legislation, if any, should deal with the speed and impact that deliberate online falsehoods might have. That any process needs to have routes of redress, appeal, and judicial oversight to ensure that it's fair, it's balanced, it's appropriately enacted. And that it gets the balance right between the positive and negative liberties of freedom of speech, was one of the characterizations one of the witnesses put, and that we are then potentially can restore a better function to the marketplace of ideas. So if we are to have legislation, that would be the kind of envelope of parameters that the legislation needs to be shaped within. Would that be something broadly that you all could agree with, or do you have further comments on potential legislation that we might have to consider?
Again, from the consumer's perspective, I think there will certainly be some fears that, for example, if I share unwittingly an online falsehood, will I then be charged? And these are, again, the kinds of pressures on consumers on their media literacy, right? They start to be a little bit paranoid, they start to be a little bit overcautious, and that's where the whole idea of the legislation must be quite clear about the intent of the perpetrator. And so that's where I would like to exercise a little bit of caution that if we are going to introduce legislation, that we should also be able to educate the lay consumer as to what their responsibilities are and what their potential liabilities are.
But broadly, you would agree with the potential sort of shape of what the legislation could and shouldn't, or would or wouldn't do that I've just described?
Yes.
I have a couple of concerns when it comes to legislation. I say in my submission that I think legislation is required because this is a very serious threat for all the points that Dr. Jani have made about the speed of the threat, the evolution. So I think one concern I have is I'm not a lawyer, so obviously I wouldn't have a concrete solution to propose. But one issue I'm concerned about is the flexibility of this of any laws that get put into place to evolve with the threat. We're talking about online falsehoods today. I don't know whether that will evolve in the future, to a different type of platform that is of a different form of technology or something like that. I can't necessarily postulate into the future, but how fast will our laws be able to evolve with something like that? Which then led me to another point about that's why we need a multi-pronged strategy. It's not necessarily just laws, but our laws should have some element of that. The other point that I wanted to make was that we're in a space where we are contesting the hearts and minds of people, where emotions are involved. So when we put together a legislative framework, when we do measures like this select committee as well, I think the ability to communicate this in a way that people understand, accept, trust, and believe in is going to be crucial. We see too many examples of governments around the world who, either through ham-fisted, communication efforts or non-communication efforts, fail to gain the kind of popular support for the good things that they're trying to do, and then it backfires. And I think that this is because this is laws that pertain to winning the hearts and minds of news consumers. being able to communicate these ideas, the principles behind the context, the aims and the measures becomes even more crucial. It is precisely in a space where good communication is required. These laws pertain to communication and to news, and hopefully they are communicated in the right way.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for your comments and your submissions, and for appearing before us and for your patience. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Pritam Singh?
Thank you, Mr. Fang and Professor Lim, for coming before the committee, even though it's quite late in the day now. I have a question for Mr. Fang, and this pertains to one of the recommendations that was made in your submission, and something which SMS Journal touched upon, which was the suggestion to move into a model like a not-for-profit model like the BBC. And you spoke about morale issues based on your 18 years experience in newsrooms, and how these compare against courses that you've attended in London at the BBC, where you find the passion and energy of those editors and journalists, even junior journalists, there being of a being much more evident, I would say. In that context, do you think there's a particular reason over and above the current pressures that are faced in newsrooms, be it financially or be it because of the online media, other reasons that explain why there is this difference in passion within the mainstream media in Singapore? I mean, I ask because I'm not in that space, so many of us I don't think are. So would there be any reason? And secondly, in connection with that, I would think it's unlikely that there would be a significant change in the structure to a not-for-profit model, at least in the short term. For your sake, I hope I'm wrong. But assuming we don't get there, are there any other intermediary steps that can be considered to improve the level of energy and passion among the local mainstream media space? And are they concerned about things like OB markers, which explain this lack of passion?
All right. Okay, I got it. Got the question. 2 questions. Thank you. I think first and foremost, I wanted to make clear, and I was concerned that maybe in my submission it wasn't necessarily very clear. I think that the issue of morale is not linked to the for-profit structure of the companies. I don't think that's ever been a case. Nobody comes to the journalist and says, one of your KPIs is getting more readers for your articles, otherwise, you don't get a bonus. It's never been a case of that. I think the morale issue is largely linked to the competitive pressures and the general concern that traditional mainstream media is waning in terms of importance, desirability, attractiveness to our audience. I think nobody necessarily wants to work in a vacuum to put out information that nobody reads. Journalists put in really a lot of effort into producing good quality work, and it's just disheartening when you see readership numbers and viewership numbers coming down. And I think that that is the main source of concern. I don't think, and this is again based on my personal experience and it's anecdotal, I don't think there's really the sentiment that you were alluding to about OB markers, about control. In that sense, it is a very popular impression that many people have. I give talks in schools, and there's quite a lot of questions about state control, about mouthpiece, and things like that. And I tell everyone that in my almost 18 years of experience working in journalism, nobody has ever stood behind me and said, "Don't use that word, don't say that thing, don't do that." Is there a certain element of self-censorship? I would say probably there is, because you're not the only one to share some of those concerns, and I think some people within even the media profession are worried about things like that. But nobody has ever, and I tell all the young journalists as well, is that your job is to provide objective reporting, factual, contextual, accurate, and timely. That is what we own. We owe our audience and we owe our consumers, to be able to carry out our duties in that way. And we do see a lot of very young, passionate people who are willing to come in and to work in that space. But it's getting harder and harder to attract and retain that sort of talent going forward. So, okay, that sort of segues nicely into my answer to your second question of what we can do if we can't move into a not-for-profit model for our media industries in Singapore. And I think it's about sending the right signals to the people in the industry and to journalists, to editors, to people who work in that space, that journalistic excellence should be the hallmark of what they do day in, day out, every single day. And one idea that I had was, we have the notion of the Pulitzer Prize as a pinnacle of journalism in major countries. Why don't we have something similar that is for Singapore? Individual media companies have their own internal news awards and annual awards. I think we have platforms like the Asian Television Awards where they give out prizes for news as well. But why can't we have something that recognizes excellence in journalism on a national scale? And I think that this sends a signal not just to people within the news industry, but it also sends a signal to consumers that this is something that we as a society should value, that we as a society respect, honor, and award. And of course, it sends a very, very strong signal to aspiring journalists that this is the sort of thing that you can aim towards. You should try to produce the quality of a Pulitzer something. Why don't we try to break, global exclusives, that kind of stories. Singapore is a very important hub in the world for a number of different industries and sectors and finance. Very important things are happening in Singapore, and our journalists should be, pushed to go and cover these sort of things, to produce scoops and exclusives that would really resonate with our readers and our audience, and we can recognize that if we have something like the Singapore Pulitzer. So those are some of the ideas I've had, and I think we need to continue building the culture within the newsrooms and signal to them that this is where we're headed, this is what we really want, which is excellent, top quality journalism.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you, Mr. Fang, Prof. Lim, for your contributions here and also for your patience waiting for your turn to come up. We'll send you a transcript of these proceedings. If there are any errors or corrections, please correct them and send it back to us. So once again, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much, Chair, Ministers, members. Thank you.